The engine died without warning. One moment, 67 tons of German steel surged forward through frozen Belgian darkness. The next, silence. Total, humiliating silence. Joachim Peiper pressed his gloved fist against the turret hatch. The metallic clang echoed through the pre-dawn forest. His driver called up from below, voice stripped of its usual discipline. The reserve tank was empty too. Peiper climbed down from his command tank. His boots hit the frost-hardened soil of Hansfeld, Belgium. The date was December 17, 1944. Around him, the most powerful armored column Germany had assembled in 2 years sat motionless. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 of the Wehrmacht's finest soldiers, all paralyzed by the same invisible enemy. Not American rifles, not artillery, empty fuel tanks. Through the gray morning mist, shapes emerged from the darkness ahead. The abandoned American position at Hansfeld. The 99th Infantry Division had pulled back in haste. Fires still burned in oil drums. Coffee sat warm in tin cups. And there, lined up in pale gray light, stood something Peiper had not dared hope for. Rows upon rows of olive-drab jerry cans. Thousands of them, stacked 3 meters high, stretching 200 meters in every direction. His adjutant pried open one can and raised it to his nose. High-octane gasoline, American gasoline, 50,000 gallons of it. Peiper walked slowly among the stacks, counting, calculating. His men moved in near silence, almost reverent. As the first tanks began refueling, as engines coughed back to life across the column, a thought settled into Peiper's chest like cold iron. Not triumph, something far heavier. If the Americans could abandon this much fuel while retreating in panic, then Germany had already lost. To understand why that thought broke something inside him, you have to understand what fuel meant in Germany by late 1944. It meant everything. It meant survival. Since May of that year, Allied bombing had reduced Germany's synthetic fuel production by 90%. The great hydrogenation plants at Luna, Blechhammer, and Brux had been reduced to smoldering wreckage. The Luna works output 175,000 tons in April. By September, it managed just 5,000. 5,000 tons. Against a Wehrmacht that needed millions. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had placed these numbers on the Führer's desk in June. The report was clear. Germany could not sustain offensive mechanized warfare. The fuel simply did not exist. Hitler read the report and ordered an offensive anyway. Because in Hitler's world, will conquered mathematics. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, scraping together every synthetic barrel and every drop from captured Romanian fields, managed 33 million. Less than 2% of American output. The East Texas oil field alone outproduced all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries ran at such capacity that engineers were developing new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude to experiment with. Meanwhile, German farmers had returned to horse-drawn plows. Private automobiles had not moved on German streets since 1942. The Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual liters. Individual liters. Not barrels. That was the reality Peiper's soldiers lived inside every single day. And yet Hitler had ordered Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, one final armored thrust through Belgium and Luxembourg, aimed at the port of Antwerp. The German High Command knew it was a gamble. Most suspected it was suicide, but orders were orders. Kampfgruppe Peiper was designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point, the tip of the entire spear. On December 14th, General Sepp Dietrich delivered his fuel briefing with brutal honesty. Peiper's column would receive 31,000 gallons for the drive to the Meuse River. The Meuse was 65 miles away. 31,000 gallons covered 50 miles of combat operations. The math of failure was built directly into the plan from the beginning. Peiper issued strict orders before the column moved. Engines off during any halt longer than 5 minutes. Single-file movement to conserve fuel. Capture of American fuel dumps was priority 1. Above tactical objectives, above everything. Because without American fuel there was no offensive, there was only a slow death in the Belgian snow. The column began rolling on December 16th, already behind schedule. The roads on German maps looked like highways. In reality, they were narrow country lanes threading through dark forest. Traffic jams formed within hours. At Lanzerath, a single American intelligence platoon of 18 men held up Peiper's entire spearhead for nearly 10 hours. During those 10 hours, the tank sat idling, burning fuel, burning the irreplaceable. When the column finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's vehicles had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of their total allocation. The mission was mathematically impossible before it had truly begun, and then came the jerry cans. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman found the depot's shipping manifests in a small office near the fuel stacks. He could read English, a skill learned in his father's import business before the war. This fuel had been pumped from wells in Texas, shipped by rail to New York, loaded onto Atlantic convoys, offloaded at Liverpool, ferried across the Channel to Normandy, then trucked 400 miles east to this forward supply point in Belgium. 6,000 miles in under 6 weeks. And when the Americans retreated, they simply left it behind. Hoffman brought the papers to Peiper. The commander read them twice, then folded them carefully and placed them in his coat pocket. He said nothing for a long moment, but the color had drained from his face. That same morning, a soldier found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline celebrated a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun. Capacity, 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would consume during the entire offensive. The captured fuel pushed the column forward. They reached Bullingen by midday, capturing more supplies and maps showing additional American depots across the region. But the maps revealed something unsettling. American fuel was everywhere. Every major crossroads had a depot. The U.S. First Army alone held 3.5 million gallons in reserve, not counting what was in transit, not counting what was being pumped through the pipelines at that very moment. Snow began falling as the column pushed west. The forest closed in. The cold was absolute. German soldiers huddled against tank hulls, watching pine trees dissolve into gray sky. The machines moved through it all like dark ships through a pale sea. Powerful, magnificent, inevitable. And slowly, quietly, running out of time. By evening on December 17th, Peiper's advanced guard reached Stavelot. What lay there would change everything. The Stavelot fuel depot held 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline, spread across 15 acres in those same olive-drab jerry cans. If Peiper's column could seize it intact, the drive to the Meuse was guaranteed. This was the depot that could win the offensive. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received warning of the German approach with just enough time to act. His orders were absolute: deny the fuel at all costs. His engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed by hand. At 16:30, as the first German vehicles appeared in the distance, the order was given. The first grenade hit the trail. Fire moved like a living thing. A wall of flame shot 100 feet into the gray Belgian sky. Within minutes, the entire depot was an inferno. The column of black smoke rose 1,000 feet. It could be seen for 20 miles in every direction. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find a bonfire consuming enough fuel to have powered his entire division to Antwerp and back. The depot burned for 3 days. Peiper stood on his tank turret and watched the fire. He said nothing for 5 full minutes. Then he climbed down. They had just burned 2 million gallons to deny him 50,000. The scale of that act was beyond German comprehension. Not because American engineers were reckless, but because 2 million gallons was genuinely not worth saving. It was a rounding error, an afternoon's delivery. Across the Ardennes in those first days, American engineers destroyed fuel dumps wherever the German advance threatened them. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million went up. Allied forces deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons in the first week alone. More than Germany had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. The Red Ball Express had built this abundance. 6,000 trucks running around the clock had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies across France since August. The system itself consumed more fuel monthly than German Army Group B received in the same period. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded his figures for December 18th. Receipts: 1,847,000 gallons. Issued to combat units: 1,623,000. Net gain to reserves: 224,000 gallons. America was accumulating fuel while actively fighting, growing richer in petroleum even as the battle raged. By December 1944, Allied forces consumed 7.5 million gallons daily and received 8.2 million. The overflow poured into reserves already overflowing. This was the world Peiper's discovery had cracked open. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, somewhere quiet, take a moment. What happened next in that Belgian forest is not just history. It is the moment an army finally understood the truth it had been avoiding for 2 years. Drop your location in the comments below. If this story moves you, subscribe, because there are dozens more where this one came from, and every single one matters. By December 19th, the arithmetic was undeniable. Since the offensive began, Peiper's column had consumed 67,000 gallons and captured perhaps 55,000. The column was operating at a net deficit. Every mile forward cost more than it recovered. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile on good roads. In Ardennes snow, that figure climbed 40%. The terrain chosen because it was lightly defended was also slowly draining every vehicle in the column dry. On December 20th, the radio message arrived. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Those words were brutally short. They carried the full weight of a verdict. Peiper gathered his commanders in a farmhouse near Stoumont. A single candle burned on the table. Windows were frosted shut. One officer calculated fuel reserves at perhaps 8,000 gallons for the entire column. The Meuse was 30 kilometers distant. In a quiet voice that carried more weight than any shouted order, Peiper described what they had found, what they had seen burning, and what it meant. The Americans had destroyed more fuel to deny it than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. Hansfeld had seemed miraculous. It was nothing to them. Less than a morning's delivery. The room went completely silent. Outside, snow pressed against the windows. Distant artillery rolled through the dark. Every man in that farmhouse understood what Peiper already knew. They were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting a nation powered by oil fields and refineries and pipelines and factories that ran every hour of every day. A nation so saturated with abundance, it could burn millions of gallons to prevent a tactical inconvenience. By December 21st, Peiper's column was surrounded near Lignes. The 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Armored Division combined received 340,000 gallons for that single day. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons for his entire command. His tanks sat immobile, fuel gauges flat against empty. The mightiest armored spearhead Germany had fielded in the West had been stopped not by mines, not by superior tanks, by logistics. On the night of December 23rd, Peiper gave the order to abandon the vehicles. The remaining fuel, perhaps 200 gallons scraped from every tank, was used to destroy the equipment. 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, 177 other vehicles, all of them burning in the Belgian forest. The orange light pushed through the trees. To anyone watching from the tree line, it might have looked like a celebration. It was the opposite. Of the 5,000 men who moved out with Kampfgruppe Peiper on December 16th, approximately 770 returned to German lines. They walked through frozen forest, through American lines, in darkness. They left behind the machines that had defined them, left them empty and burning in a Belgian wood. The knowledge spread through German ranks like cold water through stone. General Hasso von Manteuffel received the figures from captured American supply records. 8 million gallons burned to deny the Germans. He later wrote that when he learned those numbers, he understood the Ardennes offensive had failed before it truly began. Not because of American fighting quality, not because of Allied air power, because of American abundance. because of what it meant when a nation could destroy 8 million gallons as a tactical inconvenience. Field Marshal Model read the same reports on December 26th. He read the quantities twice without speaking. 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, which had saved Peiper's column, was less than 1% of what Americans casually destroyed that same week. Model set the papers down and said simply that they were not fighting the same war. He was right. They had never been fighting the same war. The United States in 1944 produced 50% of total world manufacturing output. America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil that year. Germany managed 33 million. The entire Axis combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum output. They had not merely miscalculated the offensive. They had miscalculated the entire war. After the Ardennes failed, there were no more offensives. Germany had spent its last armored reserves, its last trained crews, its last irreplaceable fuel. By February 1945, Allied bombing had effectively ended German synthetic fuel production. Entire panzer divisions sat immobile in defensive positions, tanks operational, crews experienced, ammunition full, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. General Major Fritz Bayerlein described it plainly. His division had 42 operational tanks and sufficient ammunition. They had 300 liters of fuel, not enough to reach the next town. They destroyed their tanks and walked to captivity. Peiper survived the war. He was imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes committed during the Ardennes offensive. He spoke rarely about the battle, but in 1967, he told a historian that finding that depot at Hansfeld had been the worst thing that happened to him in the entire war. Not because it gave false hope, but because it showed him truth too clearly and too late. He had discovered an enemy who measured fuel in oceans, while Germany measured it in drops. He had discovered pure impossibility. On July 14, 1976, Peiper was killed at his home in France. The case was never solved. In a museum in La Glaise, Belgium, his Tiger tank still sits where it stopped, fuel gauge resting on empty. Visitors walk around it and ask the same question every time. Why did they leave it? Why abandon something so powerful? The answer is printed on a small placard beside the tank. It ran out of fuel. That is the whole story. The most powerful armored force Germany assembled in the West was not broken by American bravery, not outmaneuvered by Allied generals. It was undone by a fuel gauge falling to zero in a frozen Belgian forest, while American depots overflowed 3 miles away. The 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld were never a miracle. They were a glimpse behind a curtain, a single glance at the true scale of what Germany had decided to fight. Wars between industrial powers are not decided by courage or tactics or the brilliance of generals. They are decided in oil fields and refineries and factory floors. They are decided long before the first shot is ever fired. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably among the most experienced fighting men on earth. It did not matter. Behind every American soldier stood an industrial machine that produced more in a single afternoon than Germany could allocate in a month. The Tiger tank in La Glaise sits in silence now, a monument not to power but to its limits, not to war but to the mathematics that govern it. The fuel gauge reads empty. It has always read empty. It always will.